So we're going to start right at 7 o'clock. Welcome here. Here we are in the last of 3 sessions by Dan Epp-Tiessen entitled, How Did We Get from the Bible to the Genocide in Gaza? It has been offered by Mennonite Church Canada Palestine Israel Network and Mennonite Central Committee Manitoba. And I would like to thank Mennonite Central Committee Canada and Manitoba specifically for the communications and the technical assistance that allowed this Zoom webinar series to happen. I, as a representative of Mennonite Church Canada Palestine Israel Network and MCC Manitoba, want to acknowledge our appreciation to every one of you who chose to spend time considering how faith, the Bible, and our global context have shaped one of the most apocalyptic realities in the 21st century in real time in Gaza. Let us remind ourselves of the responsibility also that we bear to witness to suffering, to bear witness to resilience and to the worth and dignity of every human life. In doing so, we must acknowledge we gather on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. Settlers have specific responsibilities in the journey of reconciliation to the original peoples of these lands and to our Mother Earth. As those longing to follow Jesus' example to love our neighbor as ourselves, we may seek to disarm structures of oppression. We are called to do so. And may all God's people and creation experience truth and mercy, justice and peace. We who live on treaty lands or unceded territory give thanks to Creator and to those who have lived in sacred relationship to the lands for generations. Can you spotlight me, Riel? Thanks. As has been the practice, we will listen to the presentation for the first hour, and then there will be time for questions and answers. The chat function has been disabled, but you can type your questions through the presentation, throughout the presentation, and I will present as many as I can in the last half hour of this event. We will end at 8:30, so just put those questions in the Q&A box. Many of you have requested a link to the recordings of the webinar. This is a very important part of the presentation tonight because I've got lots of emails about it. Yes, at some point in the next few days, you will receive a link, all of you, if you've registered, to the series. The link will have all 3 of the webinars available for you to listen to as many times over as you wish. So I would like to introduce Dan Epp-Tiessen once again. And for those of you who have joined us for the first time, here's a little bit of a bio. He is a retired professor from teaching Bible and theology at Canadian Mennonite University. He did that for 26 years. He is grateful for the ongoing opportunities to live with his vocation of teaching and preaching the Bible and Christian faith, especially without assignments to mark in the evening. So he's happy that he's now able to do this for us, and so are we. Dan is active in solidarity efforts to resist Israel's settler colonial oppression of Palestinians and its genocide in Gaza. Dan enjoys gardening, birdwatching, camping, biking, exercising, and spending time with his wife, Esther, as well as their children and grandchildren. Dan, I'm going to hand the most of the rest of the evening over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for that lovely opening. Okay, how did we get from the Bible to genocide in Gaza? We're following 3 sort of different tracts. One is the Bible's land promises that played such a huge role in creating European colonization, settler colonialism, and that the Jewish Zionist movement that created the state of Israel sort of bought into that mentality, and in that process then dispossessed many Palestinians of their land. Then last week we looked at New Testament language, New Testament passages that are critical of Jewish people, Jewish leaders, and looked at how the church's theologians built a very virulent anti-Semitic theology using those passages that eventually made Europe unsafe for Jewish people, which led to the Zionist movement, the desire to colonize Palestine, create a Jewish state in Palestine that would be a land of refuge for persecuted Jews. Today, Christian Zionism, how it uses the Bible and the role that it has played in bringing Palestine to where it's at today, which includes, of course, the genocide in Gaza. So I'll begin with a very simple definition of Christian Zionism, the belief that Christians should support the establishment, ongoing existence of the modern state of Israel because this state, Israel, plays a critical role in God's plans and purposes for the world. So, I'm going to make this here. Okay, two opening bold claims about Christian Zionism. That if it had not been for the support of British Christian Zionists, the Jewish Zionist movement would not have been successful in establishing the State of Israel. In other words, the current State of Israel would not exist had it not been for British Christian Zionists. And secondly, without the huge influence, massive political impact of American Christian Zionism, the U.S. would not be so totally gung-ho to support the State of Israel, including being sort of co-sponsor of the genocide in Gaza. Israel dropped so many bombs on Gaza within the first weeks of the genocide that it very quickly ran out of munitions, and then Joe Biden and later Donald Trump were happy to provide what Israel was lacking in terms of firepower. So these are the claims that we're going to be exploring and unpacking this evening. Okay, rationale for Christian Zionism. There's somewhat different types of Christian Zionism depending on the rationale. So the first one I list here is a humanitarian rationale that became popular after World War II. When Christian theologians, they felt terrible about the Holocaust, as they should have. And there was a realization of an awareness of the long, long history of Christian anti-Semitism that had played a major role in bringing about the Holocaust. And so one of the ways that a lot of post-World War II mainline Christian theologians responded was with support for the Zionist cause. Jewish people needed their own state in Palestine as a safe haven. More recently, fewer and fewer mainline theologians take that track because many have seen the impact of the Zionist movement and how that Zionist movement has done so many horrible things to Palestinians. And so this form of Zionism, that Christian Zionism that was very popular after World War II, is much less popular today. The two main forms of Christian Zionism today are based on the formation of the modern state of Israel fulfills biblical prophecy. That means it's part of God's will. That means Christians should support the modern state of Israel. And secondly, then the formation of the state of Israel kicks off the end time scenario that's going to bring us the rapture and the return of Jesus and the millennium. And all of that is something that Christians should be looking forward to. Therefore, we should support the state of Israel because none of that good stuff at the end of time can happen without the state of Israel. Okay, four different kinds of biblical texts that lie at the core of Christian Zionism. One kind of text, the Bible's land promises, that we looked at in the first session of this webinar. All those many promises where what God promises to give the land of Canaan, Palestine to Abraham and the Israelite people forever. And then there's those stories of Israel's miraculous conquest of the land of Canaan with God's help and the subsequent slaughter, ethnic cleansing of the Canaanites. And this shapes the imagination of Christian Zionists. That, wow, in the Bible, this is how God's people act. And so when the modern state of Israel acts in similar ways by inflicting massive ethnic cleansing on Palestinians, that is not morally troubling for a lot of Christian Zionists because, well, that's how God's people act in the Bible, and if it was good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for today. I should go back to those land promises. I forgot to mention one thing. Christian Zionists believe that these land promises are still in effect. What God promised way back then is still in effect. Therefore, Jewish people have an unquestioned right to the land of Palestine. Okay, third set of texts. Prophetic promises. In 586, the Babylonian Empire destroyed Judah, uh, totally destroyed the city of Jerusalem, its temple. The king was taken into exile in Babylon, as were many of the leading citizens. It was a horrible time of massive death, looting, killing. You can imagine the terror. And this catastrophe also created a major spiritual crisis. Are we still God's people? Does God still care about us? I mean, it looks like God has abandoned us. What's going on here? The biblical prophets resoundingly respond to that spiritual crisis by saying, no, God has not forgotten us as the Israelite people. And the covenant between God and Israel is still intact. And there will be a time of future restoration where God will bring the exiles back to the land and create a powerful Jewish state. So the prophetic books are full of those kind of promises. The gathering the exiles, bringing them home, and then creating a powerful Jewish state. So after the time of Babylonian exile, there was a small return, a small rebuilding, but didn't quite live up to the hopes, dreams that we see in many of these passages. So those passages, in a sense, have been sitting there to some extent unfulfilled. Christian Zionism sees in the modern formation of the state of Israel the fulfillment of these ancient biblical promises. And then, fourthly, God will bless those who bless Abraham, Israel, and God will curse those who curse Abraham, Israel. Genesis 12:3. This is from the call of Abraham when and Genesis 1 to 11 1 to 12 11, sorry, highlight the problem of human sin and brokenness and the spread of human sin. Genesis 12 and on, in a sense, describe God's strategy for responding to that human brokenness and sin. God begins to form the people of Israel, who will receive the gift of God's salvation, who will be given revelation to help them live in keeping with God's gift of salvation, and who will be the means by which God wishes to bring blessing and salvation to all of humanity. Hence, God says to Abraham, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's God's purpose. Um, and then the fate of individual nations, peoples, is to some extent in their own hands. Those who bless Abraham, Israel will receive blessing, and those who curse Abraham, Israel will experience curse. So, especially some contemporary American Christian Zionists use this argument to say the United States must always support the modern state of Israel because it's in American self-interest. That by doing that, the United States will bring divine blessing upon itself. Okay. Um, these The origin, okay, a little bit about all those land promises. God promising to give the land to the people of Israel. In the first 1600 years of the church's history, because of Christian anti-Semitism, the church believed that the church had replaced Israel. And so all of the promises of the Old Testament applied to the church or were fulfilled in Jesus Christ, fulfilled in the life of the church. And so during these first 16 centuries, no one ever dreamed that 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 the Bible was calling for a future restoration of a powerful Jewish state in Palestine. Because of Christian anti-Semitism, the Jewish people were, as I said last week, consigned to the dustbin of history. That way of thinking begins to shift somewhat with the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church has always been quite comfortable interpreting scripture fairly loosely, figuratively, symbolically, even allegorically. One of the emphases of the Protestant Reformation was the authority of scripture. And Martin Luther especially spoke against allegorical and to some extent symbolic ways of interpreting scripture. Scripture is authoritative, it has a plain sense, and scripture must be interpreted literally. So, as a result of that trajectory that the Protestant Reformation set in motion, in the 1700s, there were a variety of church theologians, pastors, who began to argue, those land promises, those promises of restoration that we see in the biblical prophets, all biblical prophecies have to be fulfilled literally. And those promises are sitting there unfulfilled. That means that they're going to be fulfilled someday. And so in the 1700s, there were various theologians that began to argue for they were Christian Zionists who said someday Jewish people will return to Palestine, create a Jewish state there, because that's what these prophetic texts tell us will happen, and all prophecy must be fulfilled. That way of so interestingly, Christian Zionism precedes Jewish Zionism by at least 150 years, because Jewish Zionism didn't begin until the end of the 1800s, whereas early Christian Zionism begins in the 1700s. Okay, Christian Zionism got a big boost by this cheery looking fellow, John Nelson Darby. He was an Anglican priest, became very disillusioned with the Church of England, the Anglican Church in England. It wasn't pious or evangelical or biblical enough. So he joined together with a group of others, and eventually they formed what became the Plymouth Brethren Church, which is still a conservative evangelical denomination in Canada, England, and United States. Darby was fascinated by biblical end times passages. And the world would be a whole lot better place if Darby had spent a lot more time doing pastoral care than so much time studying these biblical end times passages. So he was just preoccupied by these passages. So what he did is, in essence, he took snippets of passages from a whole bunch from Ezekiel, a whole bunch from Daniel, some from Isaiah, a few from Joel, a few from Zechariah, a few from the Gospels, a few from Paul's letters, a big chunk from Revelation, threw all these passages into a big blender, and out came this beautiful end time scheme that is still preached on late night cable TV by Christian end times preachers. So that common end time scheme that's still widely preached, it was developed by John Nelson Darby. And you get these amazing kinds of charts that are far too complex to explain. But key features of this end times are the rise of an antichrist figure, a 7 year period of the rapture, of course, the 7 year period of tribulation, then the millennium, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all of that. But what sets all of this end times sort of scenario in motion is the return of Jewish people to Palestine and the creation of a Jewish state. So Darby, he traveled widely to promote his ideas in England and in America. I made several trips to America. And more, these ideas began to take hold. And in the US, in Canada, these end times beliefs and the timelines and so forth were shared and taught through a whole network of Bible schools, tracts, evangelical publications, later on radio ministries, and then TV, and of course now the internet. Big name evangelicals like Dwight L. Moody, Cyrus Scofield were behind it. Cyrus Scofield produced a Bible called the Scofield Reference Bible that whose footnotes explain this end time scheme. Some of you will remember Hal Lindsey of late great Planet Earth fame from the 1970s, the Left Behind novels from the 1990s that sold 80, 90 million copies, a massive publishing profitable success. All of these things are all rely on and propagate the end time scheme that was first put together by John Nelson Darby. Okay. Uh, but what's key for us in this end time scheme is that the return of Jews to Palestine, the formation of a Jewish state kicks the whole thing off. Okay, in Britain, what happens is that some British politicians are impacted by these ways of thinking, like this man, Lord Shaftesbury. And uh, they start believing that these biblical texts must be fulfilled. Jewish people must return to Palestine. And for Shaftesbury, this is just a great opportunity because he's at this time the British Empire is still massive. It spans the globe. And his whole vision is that Britain should promote the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine because it will give the British Empire a foothold in the Middle East and will beat the French to the Middle East. Um, and Shaftesbury was an anti-Semite. And the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine was a good way to get rid of some of Europe's Jews. And you could fulfill biblical prophecy at the same time. And isn't life wonderful when all of these different purposes can come together? Okay, a little bit of background now. Okay, for about 600 years, Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Turkey. You see the red arrow there? That points to Palestine. The area right above the area of the red arrow is Turkey, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire. And during Shaftesbury's time in the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire is starting to weaken. And France and Britain are hovering like vultures, just waiting to pick off any parts of the Ottoman Empire that they can. So Lord Shaftesbury sees this great opportunity here to promote the interests of the British Empire, get rid of some of Europe's Jews, and fulfill biblical prophecy by promoting the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And he begins to do things like get surveyors to survey Palestine in preparation for large-scale immigration of Jewish people. Okay, then on the Jewish front, A number of Jewish leaders in the late 1800s independently come up with the idea, because of anti-Semitism in Europe, that Jewish people should create a Jewish state in Palestine. And it was always about creating a Jewish state, not a multi-ethnic state, a Jewish state, primarily for Jewish people, that would be a safe haven for persecuted Jews. This man, Theodor Herzl, was the man who put wheels on the vision. So he traveled across Europe, speaking wherever he could, organizing, raising funds, lobbying European political leaders, and gathering support to promote the Zionist cause. And I'm just going to skip a few here. So this interesting looking fellow, an Anglican priest, William Hechler, he had bought into Darby's views and Christian Zionist views in a big way. And so he, on his own, he had heard about Herzl and he sought Herzl out and he said, "What can I do to help? What can I do to help your Zionist cause?" So that illustrates how Christian Zionists are beginning to help the Jewish Zionists. And as I said, after Lord Shaftesbury, there were always powerful British politicians who were Christian Zionists and advocated for the cause. And this becomes critically important because, okay, by 1914, the Ottoman Empire is greatly diminished. It has lost most of its European holdings. And 1914 is when the Ottoman Empire has become very weak. World War I breaks out. The Ottoman Empire sides with Germany, and we know who lost World War I. Britain uses the excuse of World War I to invade the Middle East. And when the war is over, or to invade and conquer the Middle East, when the war is over, the Ottoman Empire is toast, it dissolves, and it's still sort of the remnants of the European imperial era. And so France and Britain divide up the Middle East. Britain gets Palestine and Jordan. France takes Lebanon and Syria. And then after World War I, Lord Balfour becomes the Foreign Secretary. That means he's responsible for British foreign policy. Lord Balfour is a Christian Zionist, as is the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And this is a total game changer for what happens in Palestine. So in 1917, Lord Balfour sends a letter to Lord Rothschild, who is one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Britain. He sends a letter on behalf of the British government in which he declares the government's sympathy for Jewish Zionist aspirations. And those aspirations are, of course, to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And this letter has come to be known as the Balfour Declaration. And I was in Palestine last November on a solidarity trip, and I was stunned at how often the Balfour Declaration came up in conversation with Palestinians. They know that this Balfour Declaration shafted them and that it marked a turning point. Okay, so the declaration goes on to say, the government is in favor of establishing in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. And it will do whatever it can to facilitate this endeavor. But then it gets weird, or not weird, but stupid. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Empires often have very foolish foreign policies, and this is a prime example. So Britain wants to have it both ways. On one hand, well, we're not going to do anything to harm the interests of the local population. On the other hand, we're going to sponsor this major immigration colonization project that's going to bring huge numbers of for like European Jews to Palestine with the goal that they will take over the land and resources. And that's not going to harm the local Palestinians. Okay, so the Balfour Declaration is just badly, badly flawed from the very beginning. But it's impossible to overstate the significance of the Balfour Declaration for ongoing developments in Palestine. Without this Balfour Declaration, the modern state of Israel would never have happened, or at least not the way it did. So imagine if the British had said, there's no way we're going to allow Jewish immigration to Palestine. Imagine if the British had said, Palestine is the home of Palestinians. We're committed to the development of a Palestinian state in Palestine. If the British had made those kind of commitments, uh, we wouldn't be having the genocide in Gaza right now. Okay, just to let you know, uh, Balfour's true sentiments. You know, in the Balfour Declaration, he says, "Oh, we don't want to bring any harm to the interests of the local folks living in Palestine." Here he expresses his true sentiments. He says, "In Palestine, we don't have any intention of even going through the motions of consulting the wishes of the locals." Right? Balfour is a total colonialist, and he's thoroughly racist towards Palestinians, Arabs, and non-Europeans. Okay, so what happens after the Balfour Declaration? On the Jewish side, Zionist side, sorry, not the Jewish side, on the Zionist side, uh, Jewish immigration to Palestine increases very, very significant. Jewish people begin to acquire land, create agricultural settlements, urban centers. They start businesses, they build schools. In other words, they very intentionally create the infrastructure and institutions of their new Jewish state that they're hoping to create. And the Zionists know that very early on, there's conflict with Palestinians. When you take the land, of course, there's going to be conflict with the locals. The Zionists know, okay, this is going to be a challenge, and so they begin to arm themselves and undergo military training. On the Palestinian side, there's a growing awareness of what the Zionist goal is to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And obviously, there's increasing grassroots resistance to that. Imagine how the people in your community would feel if all of a sudden, oh, what, Chinese, Russians, whoever start to move into your community in large numbers with the goal of we're going to create a Chinese state here, or a French, whatever kind, a German state in your backyard, right? Or whatever, Russian state. Okay. Uh, Palestinians don't have particularly good leadership. The Palestinian elite often sold out the grassroots folks. They don't share the militancy of the grassroots because it was the grassroots folks who paid the price. They were the ones who were losing access to the land. Um, and so in 1937, there is a grassroots revolt against the British, and uh, and the British suppress that revolt very harshly, and that's devastating for the Palestinian cause because after the revolt is over, the Palestinian leaders, most of the Palestinian leaders are either dead or they're in prison, or they have been exiled. And that greatly, greatly weakens the Palestinian people and prevents them from resisting the Zionist movement as much as they may have done otherwise. Um, Also, what happened is that the British armed and trained Zionist militia groups to help them suppress the Palestinian revolt. And of course, these Zionist militia groups, they kept their training, they kept their weapons that were then later used against Palestinians. Okay, World War II comes along. Britain is fighting Germany on several fronts. It does not want to tie up a lot of troops in Palestine because there's ongoing conflict between the Zionist, Jewish Zionist settlers and the Palestinians, and Britain tries to keep the peace, but it doesn't want to devote a lot of soldiers to that because they're needed elsewhere. Um, and so Britain tries to placate the Palestinians. And one of the ways it does that is by cutting back on Jewish immigration. And of course, for the Zionists, this is exactly when they want to ramp up Jewish immigration because there's large numbers of Jewish people fleeing Europe because they know what the Nazis are going to do to them. So not surprising that the Zionists want to get these refugees into Palestine, but Britain puts the brakes on. A lot of immigration still happened. It just happened behind, so-called illegally behind the backs of the the British. So the violence between Palestinians and the Zionists increases. Then, after the war, um, some of the Zionist militias begin to turn against the British, their former patrons, because they now see that the British are standing in the way of the Zionist aspirations. And the Zionists believe that they have a Jewish state almost in their hands, but now the British are the ones who are standing in the way. So Britain is getting it from all sides now. It's being attacked by Palestinians, it's being attacked by Zionist militias, and the conflict, the violence between the Palestinians and Zionists is ramping up, and Britain is not able to keep a lid on. Then in 1946, the Irgun, a Zionist terrorist group, that attacked the British, attacked Palestinian communities. It blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and killed 91 people. That's where the British military and diplomatic folks were headquartered. And at that point, British said, that's it. We're out of here. And Britain decides we're going to submit the future of Palestine for a vote at the United Nations. There had been various proposals made to the United Nations, the newly formed United Nations, for how to divvy up Palestine so that the Zionists could have their state, but also so that Palestinians could have their territory. So then, in 1947, the United Nations votes to partition Palestine, giving the Zionist territory for a Jewish state. Palestinians were not listened to, and their territories were given to Jordan. Britain withdraws in 1948, May of 1948. Immediately, the Zionists declare that their new state of Israel has come into being, and war breaks out immediately between Palestinians and the Zionist forces. The Palestinians get a little bit of help from some of the neighboring Arab states, but not a whole lot. The long and short of that war is the Zionists fought desperately. Um, Palestinians and the neighboring Arab states were not very well equipped, not very well led, not very well organized. And so the Zionist forces were actually able to expand their territory. And in 1949, the United Nations was able to create a truce. So a few maps here. The map on the far left shows the areas where Jewish settlers predominated versus where the indigenous Palestinians predominated. And you can see how Palestine was predominantly Palestinian. In that kind of a context, no wonder Palestinians said, what do you mean? you're going to give a big chunk of our territory to a Jewish state. It's our land. It always has been. Then the second map, this was the United Nations partition plan that was voted on in 1947. The white areas would be given to the state of Israel. And you see that, how that's all carved up, and it doesn't look like a very viable state. Then the third map is you can see how the Zionist forces were powerful enough to push the Palestinians back. And these were the borders until 1967, when Israel conquered these two green areas, the Gaza Strip, which had been under Egyptian control until then, and the West Bank, which had been under the control of Jordan. And then the final map, you see the territory that Israel is now controls. After 1967, Israel very, very intentionally built Jewish-only settlements in the West Bank, and that process has only intensified. It is well, when I was there last November, you could see new highways, new settlements going up everywhere. And everywhere we talked to Palestinians, they talked about land theft happening, their land being stolen for Jewish settlements. And you remember the first session I talked about settler colonialism, and the goal of settler colonialism is to get the land. And so Israeli settler colonialism, Zionist Israeli settler colonialism is still in full swing. And if you listen to Netanyahu and his cabinet ministers, Ben-Gvir and Schmoltrich, they're absolutely clear about their goal. And that is to get all of Palestine from the river to the sea for the Jewish state of Israel. Okay, so it was British Christian Zionists who were responsible for creating the mess in Palestine. And it's American Christian Zionists who are in significant ways responsible for perpetuating the mess and making it worse. So, what's happening on the American front? In the 20th century, Darby's end time scheme grows enormously in popularity, mostly among American evangelicals, propagated through a whole network of Bible schools, prophecy conferences, publications, radio, TV, etc., etc. The state of Israel is central to this scheme because it kicks off the whole end times scenario. Immediately after 1948, American political, economic, military support for the new state of Israel was lukewarm at best. But that support has been steadily growing ever since, and it's probably at an all-time high right about now. And the U.S. is totally the enabler of the genocide in Gaza. As I've said, almost all the weapons and bombs come from the U.S. The U.S. gives Israel all the diplomatic support and cover it needs at the United Nations. And the U.S. gives Israel billions and billions of dollars of economic and military aid every single year. Now, there's many reasons for the American support for the state of Israel. History is always complex, but one of those reasons is the impact of Christian Zionism in the U.S. Just like British Christian Zionism shaped in powerful ways the perspectives and actions of British politicians, American Christian Zionism shapes in powerful ways the perceptions and actions of American politicians. Okay, just to remind you, just the three main types of biblical texts that are central to Christian Zionism: the land promises, the stories of Israel's miraculous conquest of Canaan, and just like modern state of Israel has been doing, right? conquest of Canaan, subsequent ethnic cleansing, the massive ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948-49 when the new state of Israel dispossessed 1 million Palestinians of their homes and lands, and then in 1967 when the state of Israel conquered the West Bank and immediately ethnically cleansed another 200,000 Palestinians and forced them out. And since 1967, it's been slow motion land theft and ethnic cleansing. And then these prophetic promises about the restoration of the state of Israel. Now, one of the main reasons for the popularity of Christian Zionism among evangelicalism is because it seems to take the Bible so seriously. It says those ancient land promises where God gives the land to Abraham and his descendants forever, they're still in effect. And in fact, they're being fulfilled anew right before our eyes with the state of Israel. The creation of the state of Israel in 1948, its dramatic defeat of the Arab nations in the Six-Day War in 1967, it confirms the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Biblical prophecy being fulfilled as we watch. And that gave Christian Zionism a great deal of credibility in the evangelical community. Another reason for the popularity of Christian Zionism is that its end time scheme, it at least claims to make sense of the Bible's end times passages. And if you read the Bible's end times passages, they're some of the most confusing, difficult to interpret parts of the Bible, and you can't correlate them all with each other. So these are complex, difficult parts of the Bible. Yet this beautiful end times scenario makes sense, or at least it claims to make sense of them all in ways that has been convincing to many evangelicals. Now, some Christian Zionists will downplay the end time scheme because it is a little bit wacky. But still, those land promises and those prophetic promises of the restoration of the state of Israel, they're still there. And they're being fulfilled through the modern state of Israel. So what's happened then is, in the last 50 years or so, American evangelical Christianity has become much more politically active, and one might say even aggressive, and it's become incredibly powerful. Think of the way that Donald Trump, who doesn't have an evangelical Christian bone in his body, given the kind of lifestyle that he leads, the way that he caters to that evangelical Christian constituency, so much so that, in the last few days, he's even been talking about invading Nigeria because, Christians are supposedly being persecuted in Nigeria. What is that all about? It's about catering to that powerful American evangelical constituency. And one form that this evangelical Christian Zionist political activism takes is through lobbying. So Christian Zionists very intentionally seek to lobby and shape U.S. government policy so that the U.S. will become even more pro-Israel, will provide more political, economic, and military support. This man here, John Hagee, is the United States' most well-known Christian Zionist. He's pastor of a mega church, I think, in San Antonio, Texas. He founded Christians United for Israel, a Christian Zionist support and lobby group that claims to have 10 million members. So how many of us folks are on this webinar? And he's got 10 million. So it tells you what we're up against. Anyway, okay. So Kofi and John Hagee, they seek to mobilize Christian support for the state of Israel. Hagee and his organization, they lead Christian tours to Israel to show off Israel's accomplishments and how Israel fulfills biblical prophecy. He raises money for the state of Israel. He has a very high profile in Israel. When he visits Israel, he can meet with Israel's prime minister. He has spoken more than once in the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament. His sermons are full of Christian Zionism and also Islamophobia and racism against Arabs, Muslims. And if you're ever feeling too happy and too joyful, just Google John Hagee and listen to a few of his sermons, and that'll kick the joy out of you. Anyway, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other preachers like John Hagee. So much so that now, if any U.S. politician dares to be critical of the state of Israel, they will have the Christian Zionist lobby after them. Okay, I want to shift now to talk a little bit. Okay, so how might we read the Bible differently than Christian Zionism reads it? And how might we respond to Christian Zionism? One of the appeals of Christian Zionism is it sounds so biblical. But when you get right down to it, it reads the Bible as if Jesus, Paul, and the New Testament never happened. How so? Okay. It doesn't realize what the New Testament does with Old Testament land passages and land promises. One of the basic convictions of the New Testament is that Jesus fulfills all of the Old Testament promises related to God's good future, including the land promises. And that's why, despite how often the New Testament talks about God's coming good future, the formation of a Jewish state is never part of what the New Testament says. That is never mentioned once in the New Testament. Because Jesus fulfills those promises. Now, in the Old Testament, okay, God's purpose is to create the Israelite people, to be a witness to God's ways in the Middle Eastern world, to be a channel of God's blessing to the nations. And if you're going to be a people in the ancient Near East, you needed a territory, a land. So in the Old Testament, peoplehood and land are linked and they go together. And the formation of the Israelite people in the land of Canaan is a foremost in God's agenda. But in the New Testament, the plan expands, so to speak. The focus is no longer on one people in one land. The focus now is much broader. All of the world's people are invited to commit their lives to Jesus, become part of God's covenant people. And so the need for one particular piece of geography, the land of Canaan, Palestine, that falls by the way. And so the fact that the New Testament never talks about the restoration of a Jewish state is hugely significant. And it's no accident, because that was a big agenda in Jesus's time, because Palestine, the Jews were ruled by the Roman Empire that was very oppressive towards them. There was a deep longing to throw off the Roman oppression and gain Jewish independence, create a Jewish state. So much so that in the year 68, there was a major Jewish revolt against the Romans. And then again in the year 135, the Romans brutally crushed both of those revolts. So anyway, the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine was a big agenda item for a lot of Jewish people at the time of Jesus and the New Testament. Jesus never goes in that direction. Jesus transposes the land promises in a sense, and Palestinian theologians have talked about how these land promises get Christified. So, for example, the many Jewish people were living at Jesus's time, living outside the land of Palestine, and there was a longing for God to bring the Jewish people home into a nation where they would receive the blessings of living as God's people. In the New Testament, this gets Christified in the sense of you come home to receive God's blessings, live as God's people by committing yourself to Jesus. Okay? So God's salvation and blessing do not require the land of Palestine. And to some extent, Jesus transposes the land promises and changes them into the kingdom or the reign of God. Um, Jesus inaugurates God's healing, saving, liberating reign on earth. And and this reign of God on earth is universal. It's God's strategy for bringing healing to all of humankind, but even more to all of creation. So Paul talks about how creation is groaning, waiting for redemption. The final vision in the book of Revelation talks about God's renewal of heaven and earth, of all of creation. So that's sort of ultimately where this kingdom of God, this reign of God is going, the renewal of all of God's creation. So the focus becomes much bigger than what God is doing in one particular land. Now that the focus is that through Jesus, God is beginning this grand strategy of inaugurating, establishing God's reign, God's kingdom over the entire earth and over all of creation. Paul. Fascinating what Paul does with the Abraham traditions, which were very, very important for Judaism because Abraham and Sarah were the ancestors of the Jewish people. They were the first ones whom God calls. And when God calls them, God makes three really big, important promises. I will make of you a great people. I will give you the land of Canaan, and through you I will bring blessing to all the peoples of the world. So Abraham traditions, fundamental for Judaism. They're very important for Paul. But Paul does not focus on the land. He focuses on the blessing. So scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith. So already when God called Abraham, Paul says, God already had this bigger vision in mind of bringing salvation to all of the world's people. And that's why God already declared the good news, the gospel, to Abraham beforehand, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. So what's important here about the Abraham tradition is the blessing, the salvation that is now made available to the Gentiles. Another passage. Okay, so if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So what's important here is the idea of peoplehood, being a descendant of Abraham, because the descendants of Abraham are the ones who are God's special people. Um, but that doesn't any longer happen through biology. It happens through faith. And if you belong to Christ, then you are one of Abraham and Sarah's offspring uh, because you share the faith of Abraham and Sarah. So it's faith and peoplehood that matter. There's one passage where Paul talks about the land promise, and it's utterly fascinating what he does with it. For the promise that Abraham would inherit the cosmos did not come to Abraham or his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. The word that Paul uses there is the Greek word cosmos, which made its way into English, and we know what it means. Now, Paul knows better than you and I that God promised Abraham the land of Canaan. But in Paul's mind, that when God called Abraham, God was already planning, thinking ahead to what God was going to do through Jesus Christ and the establishment of God's saving, healing kingdom. And this involved the salvation of all of humanity and the cosmos. And so he signals that kind of vision by saying that God already promised Abraham that he would inherit the cosmos. So Christian Zionism, it seems to be so biblical, take the Bible seriously, but it reads the Bible as if Jesus, Paul, and the New Testament never happened. So one can make the argument that actually Christian Zionism isn't nearly biblical enough. At least it doesn't look at the trajectory of the biblical story and what happens to that trajectory in the New Testament. The Christian Zionism also ignores key biblical themes and texts. The Old Testament consistently claims that Israel can lose the promised land because of unfaithfulness. The book of Deuteronomy, even before the Israelites get to the promised land, in fact, it says you're going to lose the land. And it repeatedly warns the Israelites, if you are unfaithful in the land, if you start worshiping other gods, and if you don't practice kindness and justice in the neighborhood, then you're going to lose the land. And that's exactly what Israel's prophets say later on. And for the prophets, especially, and the prophets foretell Israel's going to lose the land in the Babylonian exile. And one of the reasons is because the Israelite people have not been actualizing the justice and righteousness in the neighborhood that are God's conditions for living in the land. So we get passages like this. Um, what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. If you're going to live in the land, you got to do so on God's terms. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And this passage from Micah, which seems to describe Zionist settler colonialism. Woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot evil on their beds. Woe to those who stay up at night planning how in the morning they're going to steal, take somebody else's land. And you know, the early Zionists in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they knew very well that Palestine was occupied by Palestinian peoples. And so they strategized, how are we going to get rid of those Palestinians and get the land? At morning's light, they carry it out because it is in their power to do it. They covet fields and seize them. Houses, take them away. They defraud people of their homes. They rob them of their inheritance. Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field till no space is left and you live alone in the land. In other words, if that's how you're going to live, where you just keep adding to your land possessions, taking the land, the fields, the homes of others, then ultimately at some point you're going to be living alone in the land, or you will be expelled from the land. Um, so these kinds of texts and themes are routinely ignored by Christian Zionists in favor of the land promises. God promised to give the land to the Israelite people forever, and that trumps everything. Um, okay, I'll leave it at that. I will end my screen share and invite your questions. And I'll look to Joanna to curate and feed me those questions.
Okay, we've got some great ones.
Okay.
We are going to start with this one. I grew up with an awareness of pro-dispensationalism and some degree of Christian Zionism. Where were the Mennonite theologians throughout the 1900s? And were there any that challenged this influence?
Walter Clausen, for one, did. I forget the book he wrote, where he very much challenged dispensationalism, Christian Zionism. By the way, Darby's scheme involved a system called dispensationalism. I didn't get into that. I'm not going to get into that, those technicalities. You can Google it. Um, um, and where were the Mennonite theologians in even in the mid 20th century? Uh, I'm a little more aware of what was going on here in Western Canada. There was a whole widespread network of Bible schools here in Western Canada that made a very significant contribution to Mennonite life and thought. And a lot of those Bible schools taught this end time scheme, and so. I th Christian Zionism, this end times thinking, was at one point quite prominent in the Mennonite community, and I certainly grew up with it and imbibed it. And since we're confessing here, I was a thorough Christian Zionist at a certain point in my life. So it has been a big part of Mennonite reality, and and the reality of many evangelical communities, but it's much, much less so nowadays for all kinds of different reasons.
So there was sort of the Great Revival experience, right, in the early 1900s? Did that connect to this theology of Christian Zionism in some way?
Often it did, partly because it's all kind of intertwined.
Hmm.
Um, if the end times are coming, boy, then you better convert quickly so that you're on the right side when it happens. And intense and the conviction, the intense conviction that the end is near is an impetus for evangelism. Because if the end is near, the time to get as many people saved as you can is really short. So uh, this kind of becomes a package. The end times are near. We better evangelize quickly, and we better support the state of Israel because the end can't happen if there isn't a state of Israel. So it all becomes, in many cases, a package deal.
Thanks, Dan. Okay. It seems that Zionism would draw a direct line between modern day Israelis and Bible times Israelites.
Hmm.
Is this true? Are they the same people?
That's an excellent question. Ask a Palestinian theologian that question, and the answer is absolutely not. Um, right. Christian Zionism makes the claim that modern day Israel is a direct uh, descendant of, continuation of biblical Israel. Is that the case? I want to be a little bit careful about what I say, partly because of the history of Christian anti-Semitism. So if Jewish people say that the modern state of Israel is a continuation of biblical Israel, okay, you can say that. Okay, I hear you on that. From a Christian perspective, I don't think so. Um, because as a Christian, I read the entire biblical story through Jesus Christ and what God is doing through Jesus. And yes, in the Old Testament story, the formation of the Israelite people who live in a particular land, that's really, really important. But in the New Testament, that's no longer important because the agenda has grown much bigger in a sense. And God's people now includes peoples from all over the world. I want to say that without saying that, the Jews are consigned to the dustbin of history. I think that the Jewish people continue to be God's people. But does God's people mean that you have to live in the land of Canaan? Not so long ago, I heard a Jewish rabbi give a speech, and I was very convinced by what she said. She made the argument that if you look at the rabbis of the first, second, and third century, the what's called rabbinic faith, which leads to modern Judaism, modern Jewish faith, uh, it made peace with living outside the land. And yeah, the land of Palestine was still important, but rabbinic Judaism was designed to help Jewish people live outside of Palestine. And Jewish people had made peace with living outside of Palestine for centuries and centuries. And in fact, was it the first session or the last session? Can't remember. I talked about by the time of Jesus, there were 5 to 7 million Jews living in the Roman Empire, and maybe 1 to 2 million lived in Palestine. So by the time of Jesus, two-thirds, three-quarters of the Jews in the world had voluntarily moved out of Palestine and were living happily in the diaspora. Um, so even within Judaism, uh, Judaism learned to live without being located in the land of Palestine. So is the modern state of Israel a continuation of biblical Israel? I don't think so, because it's a very different kind of entity. And speaking theologically, I don't think that God needs the modern state of Israel. In the biblical story, biblical Israel played a very important role in God's plans and purposes. Um, but I don't think modern Israel is needed for those plans and purposes anymore. Sorry, I've been rambling here a little bit because I was kind of thinking on my feet, but that was a really fine question, and I need to develop a more concise answer for that one.
Okay, I'm smiling because there's a lot of good questions and we don't have much time left. Here's one. Dan, when was your come to Jesus moment when you stopped being a Christian Zionist?
It didn't happen overnight, but I'll blame my high school teacher, and I know there's a couple of folks on this webinar who worked with this high school teacher, Bill Taves, in Leamington, Ontario, United Mennonite Educational Institute. He's an amazing man, great teacher. He was a science teacher, but we'd get him sidetracked, and we'd have these amazing theological conversations. And in some of those, he challenged pretty head on some of my Christian Zionist beliefs. And I think that set me on a trajectory. And then I went to what was then Canadian Mennonite Bible College, which has now been merged into Canadian Mennonite University. And the theology and biblical studies I did there took me in some very different directions.
Okay. In light of Zionism, what are implications for the future of Judaism?
Wow, that's a good question. As I said, throughout most of from about, for 1800 years or so, Judaism largely made peace with living outside of Palestine. There always was a small Jewish community in Palestine. Let's be clear about that. Maybe 10, 20, 30,000 people. But the vast majority of Jews lived outside of Palestine. There was never a push towards, let's move to Palestine in large numbers and create a Jewish state there. That only started in the late 1800s, early 1900s as a result of the Zionist movement. And initially, the Zionist movement had a very slow and tough start. So, for example, The in the Russian Empire, there was vicious persecution of Jewish people. Massive numbers of Jews were fleeing the Russian Empire. That modern day areas of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Eastern Russia, Western Russia, sorry. Um, so, and I forget the period of time, but 1 million Jews left the Russian Empire. About 1% went to Palestine. So that shows you how little support there was in the Jewish community for Zionism and the formation of the state of Israel. But as I said last week, the Holocaust changed all of that. The Holocaust showed made many Jewish people feel the Zionist argument is correct. We do need a Jewish state in Palestine to keep persecuted Jews safe. And that has marked a massive change in the faith of many Jewish people. There's a book on my shelf right behind me here written by a Canadian, very pious Canadian Jew from Montreal, who laments how the Zionist movement has what he calls, oh, I forget the language he used, how it has distorted Judaism and Jewish faith. His argument is that Judaism has historically always been about adherence to Torah. Torah is God's guidelines, especially as those guidelines are found in the first 5 books of Jewish scripture, our Christian Old Testament. That's what Judaism has always focused on, faithfulness to Torah. The modern state of Israel has, he says, changed Judaism very significantly, so that today, for many Jewish people, allegiance to the state of Israel, support for the state of Israel, has become more central than adherence to Torah. That's his argument. So there's a lot of ferment and a lot of debate going on in the Jewish community about these issues.
Thanks, Dan. So what do you suggest we do to challenge, or what can we do to challenge Christian Zionism orientations in our congregations?
I think point out that the formation of a Jewish state. Show me where you see that in the New Testament. Uh, you don't see it anywhere. Well, that should tell us something important about the shape that our Christian faith should take. So I think focusing on, oh, okay, what do we see in the New Testament, and what does the New Testament say? And how does it deal with these land traditions, these land promises? Um, and the way, in many ways, it sidelines these land promises and reinterprets them and transposes them. Um, and also to point out, this Old Testament theme. If you're going to live in the land, you got to do so on God's terms, and God's terms include justice and righteousness. And land theft, stealing the land from Palestinians is not justice and righteousness.
Yeah, one of the comments or questions was, didn't God's promise of land always come in kind of tandem with this idea that there are laws, or there are ways in which you are called to be as my
Right.
people, and
Yeah.
then land kind of follows those
Yeah. Yeah. But we
instructions.
must always remember, uh, we have the book of Joshua, where what God commands is march into Canaan and slaughter all the Canaanites and take all the land for yourselves, right? That's a story of genocide, ethnic cleansing. So we have differences of perspective in the biblical story. And that means that as people of faith, we have to do some discerning and sorting out. And we have to be able to say, there's some parts of the Bible and biblical tradition that reflect God's will more closely than do some other parts. Um, and so Christian Zionism is often very inspired by what we see in the book of Joshua. And I think we need to push back and say that I don't care what the book of Joshua says. Genocide and ethnic cleansing is always wrong, period, full stop. Yeah.
Well, that reminds me of what my friend Kathy Bergen says when asked these questions about, what about the Old Testament? And she says, well, I follow Jesus, not Joshua. But
Which
that,
is ironic because Jesus is a version of the name Joshua, and they both mean salvation. So there you go. Yeah,
Thanks. I think maybe we have time for one more question.
right. And then we'll turn it back to you, Joe. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Um, so given how convinced Zionists and their supporters are of their position, what is the likelihood they can be convinced of another truth?
Oh, that depends on the individual. Are you going to convince John Hagee? Waste of time to try, right? But if you have a good friend who's a Christian Zionist who trusts you and you have a good relationship, you can have the conversation and talk about some of these things. So it depends very, very much on the individual, your relationship with them, uh, and of course their openness. And we don't control that. So. We can speak our truth gently, kindly, respectfully, um, and sometimes that truth may be convincing, but other times it will not be. I should just say I've asked that Joanna finish this session, and I mean, you folks are all here because you have some interest in what's going on in Palestine. And I've asked Joanna to share with us a little bit some of her ideas of what
Yeah.
we as concerned people might be able to do. So go ahead, Joanna.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I just wanted to say that
And
Mennonite Church.
Rial, maybe you can spotlight Joanna and I can become a little more.
Ah,
There we go.
well, thanks. Mennonite Church Canada, Palestine Israel Network. We're moving into our 10th year mandated by the church to educate and act for justice and solidarity with Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, Jews, and many others working for an end to the genocide and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. Really, none of us are free until all of us are free. So I want to encourage all of you in saying that there's a lot to be done and there's a lot of things you can do, because sometimes it feels you listen to these 3 webinars and you hear the history and then you look at the reality and you go, well, I think I'm just gonna watch Netflix. Actually, you can do more than that, and I'm going to give you some ideas for what you can do. And I want to again thank Dan for leading us through this series and remind everyone that yes, you will be getting a link to all 3 of the webinar sessions. So first of all, and I'm going to do this very quickly, it's really important to know what's actually going on. And you're not going to get a good chunk of the truth if you listen to mainstream media, okay? It's not a problem if you do, but just remember that there's a particular lens mainstream media uses to narrate the situation in Palestine, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank, and it is not preferential option for those oppressed. That is not their lens. So I encourage you to look at alternative media sources. Al Jazeera will give you a perspective from on the ground from Palestinians. Theologian, sort of activist journalists like Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, some of those folks, Norman Finkelstein, Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, CJPME, they put out amazing resources. Independent Jewish Voices. Those kinds of organizations sometimes will or often will narrate what's happening. The Wire, which comes out very regularly from Jewish Voices for Peace in the US, excellent piece of like good, solid journalism. Electronic Intifada. I mean, I could go on. Just be aware of what you're listening to and just keep reading and having conversations. I'm going to send out a resource, a 2-page resource from the PIN network that will give you some books to read that are kind of like the core sort of historical, sort of fact-based research books, one from an Israeli and one from a Palestinian, that kind of should be in your library as a grounding kind of resource for you to have around what led up to where we are right now. Build relationships with Palestinian and Arab communities, both Muslim and Christian. There are Palestinians, there are Arab folks in your city, in your town. Get to know them. And then access reliable reports. Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders. Beit Salam is an Israeli human rights organization. They're phenomenal in what they're putting out on what's really happening on the ground. You can sign up for our Mennonite Church Canada Palestine Israel Network updates. Byron puts a lot of energy into putting those together. You get them once a month in your email box. That will give you the most sort of, what would I say, succinct kind of highlights of the past month in terms of what's happening in Palestine. It will give you things that you can do about it, like letters you can write or other ways to respond. And it will also give you prayers that that are ways also to lament and to bring forward to God what we care so much about and what we want and plead for change. We do that as Christians, right? Another thing I want to say is do not hesitate to call and write your member of parliament. If we're going to switch anything around in Canada, we need to put pressure on our elected officials. They're elected to listen to their electorate. And so I'm encouraging you not to give up. Just call and write and try to get to see them in their office if you can. And the things you want to focus on in terms of conversations are asking Canada to support international law and human rights for Palestinians in Palestine and Israel. Call for an arms embargo with Israel. No weapons to Israel, not through the US either, not through that loophole. No arms to Israel and no purchasing of arms from Israel. Ask for an end to the Canada Free Trade Agreement with Israel. And then ask Canada to hold lawmakers and politicians accountable for war crimes in Gaza. Those are the things that we're focusing on right now. Show local support. Shop in Palestinian stores. Buy Palestinian products. Eat in Palestinian restaurants. And then boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Yes, this is important. Just go on the BDS website. Type in BDS. It'll come up. All those things that we should not be purchasing because those dollars, when we're buying Israeli products, go to settlement expansion and they fund the war on Gaza. So it's hard to boycott everything, but pick and choose and boycott something. And then I guess lastly is donate to organizations that are supporting aid into Gaza and supporting, aid into the West Bank at this point, because really it's entirely under siege. It's being Gazified. So I suggest supporting Mennonite Central Committee's humanitarian aid in that part of the world. Our Mennonite Church Canada Palestine Israel Network has an initiative right now where we're encouraging folks to donate to Mennonite Church Canada to support scholarships for students going to Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem. And then there's other organizations you can support that provide humanitarian aid, Doctors Without Borders, Islamic Relief, you can pick and choose. Children's Relief, Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. They're great organizations. I guess that's what I would say. And then I'm going to close by saying, pray for a permanent ceasefire. There is no permanent ceasefire, right? Every day, Palestinians are still being killed. And today, a large building in Gaza City was destroyed. So this is ongoing, all right? So there's no permanent ceasefire. Pray for an end to Israeli occupation of 22% of Palestine. That's what Palestinians want. They want the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And pray for courage to speak the truth about the realities that Dan has brought forward for us in these webinars. This is a hard thing to do. So we need to pray that we ourselves have the courage to know when to speak and to know how to speak, but to actually speak to family, to friends and neighbors about what's going on, encouraging them to also become aware and act. So I think that ends our time together. It's 8:28. I want to thank all of you for your interest. And there will be a survey going out along with the links for the webinars that are going to ask for your opinions and suggestions for ways that we can continue the conversation or just feedback from some of what you've heard, and we'd welcome that. And thank you again for caring enough to show up, because it matters. So blessings to all of you. Good night.